Okay, I'm on Team Warfare, and I'm back with an episode on Subhumanity, the philosophy of the absurd. I'm going to start this out actually from this magazine Epiphany. With the text is called The Metaphysics of Atheism. Um, it starts out with this. The article starts with communist materialism, doctrine, and passion. So it says, it is proposed in the following pages to consider communism from a very definite point of view, the point of view of doctrine. It is not only one, to be sure, which merits attention. Communist doctrine can no more adequately explain the communist phenomenon than Christian doctrine alone explain Christianity. Communism is also essentially something more than a doctrine. It is, for instance, a phenomenon of passion, one of the most formidable not only of our time, but also, without a doubt, of history. It would be a grave mistake, however, to imagine that communism does not involve an ideological system, an elaborate, constructed philosophy, a doctrine in the strongest and fullest meaning of the word, and primarily, without doubt, a political and social economic doctrine. That is to say, a conception, property, labor, production, exchange, social relations, and the state. Karl Marx's Capital is put forward primarily as a book of political economy. What is more than that? The political economy, which it describes, completes and synthesizes what is in the fullest acceptation of the term of philosophy, a form of wisdom. Communism thereby professes to offer a conclusive explanation of things, to resolve once and for all the great problems of nature, being, life, the origin and the destiny of man. Quote, Marxism. Plekhanov declares, quote, it is a complete conception of the world. Uh, so we're here at the materialist philosophy of communism. Marxist materialism, on the above mentioned plane, finds simultaneous expression in a philosophical doctrine and in a historical, social, economic doctrine, but is primarily a philosophy. It was a philosophy that it was elaborated in the minds of its authors, and also philosophically it is fully explicable. We shall confine ourselves for the moment to the first philosophical aspects of Marxist materialism, deferring the other until some other occasion. The philosophy of communist materialism is roughly as follows. It professes to be an answer to the great fundamental question of every philosophy and more practically of modern philosophy. The question of the relation between spirit and matter, on the other hand, on the other, the relation between thought and being. Which comes first, our minds of the surrounding world and world itself? In other words, are our minds capable of knowing the real world? These are complementary forms of one of the same problem and shall be considered successfully. Spirit and nature. Let us first see what attitude Marxist materialism adopts to the first part of the question, which is the primordial element, spirit or nature. Quote, did God, create the world, or has the world been in existence eternally? Quote, the answer which the philosophers give to this question split themselves into two camps, writes Engels. Quote, those who asserted the primacy of the spirit to nature and therefore, in the last instance, assumed world creation in some form or other. And among the philosophers, Hegel, for example, this creation often becomes still more intricate and impossible in Christianity, comprise the camp of idealism. The others who regard nature as primary belong to the various schools of materialism. Quote, these two expressions, idealism and materialism, Engels continues, quote, primarily signifies nothing more than this, and here also they are not used in any other sense. What confusion arises when some other meaning is put into them will be seen below. Communist materialism, therefore, professes to be a solution of the problem of the relations between spirit and nature, according to which of these two orders it is nature which comes first. Such a materialism does not, therefore, deny spirit absolutely, but is content to assert that it is not the primordial element. Spirit does not exist independently of matter. It is in no case of substance capable of a reality of its own. Consequently, pure spirit, God, the immortal soul, separated from the body, and the subsisting after the dissolution of matter, all these are fictions devised in, quote, the very early times when men, still completely ignorant of the structure of their own bodies, under the stimulus of dream apparition, came to believe that their thinking and sensations were not activities of their bodies, but of a distinct soul which inhabits the body and leaves it at death. In an exactly similar manner, the first gods arose through the personification of natural forces, and these gods, in the further development of religion, assumed more and more an extra mundane form, until finally, by a process of extraction, I might almost say of distillation, occurring naturally in the course of man's intellectual development, out of the many more or less limited and mutually limiting gods, there arose in the minds of men the idea of one exclusive God of the monotheistic religions. Quote, nothing exists outside of nature, and man and the higher beings our religious fantasies have created are only the fantastic reflection of our own essence. End quote. Spirit, moreover, is not the principle of matter, is not the principle, the cause of matter. It is a matter, on the contrary, which is the foundation, the structure, the essence of every reality. It is the supreme cause of itself and the spirit in all its forms. Spirit is but a superior expansion of matter. Quote, matter is not a product of mind, but mind itself is a superior form of material energy at work in the world. And yet it would seem that immersed in matter, in full continuity with matter, without ever being different in kind from matter, spirit in some way or another overflows matter, and while continuing to be thoroughly dominated by matter, does not fail in its turn to act, and sometimes powerfully, upon matter. Here the adepts of Marxism do not scruple to protest against crude distortions of their doctrine. Quote, we cannot get away from the fact, writes Engels, that everything that sets men acting must find its way through their brains, even eating and drinking, which begins as a consequence of the sensations of hunger and thirst transmitted through the brain and ends as a result of the sensations of satisfaction, likewise transmitted through the brain. The influence of the external world upon man expresses themselves in his brain after reflected therein as feelings, thoughts, instincts, volitions, in short, as, quote, ideal tendencies, and in this form become, quote, ideal powers. If then a man is converted into an idealist because he, quote, follows ideal tendencies and admits that, quote, ideal powers have an influence over him, then every person who is at all normally developed and is a born idealist. And how in that case can there still be any materialist? Karl Marx in Capital asserts the reality of the spirit and the efficiency of spiritual forces even more categorically, if possible, without, however, yielding a tittle of his materialism. A spider carries out operations resembling those of the weavers, and many human architect is put to shame by the skill which a bee constructs her cell. But what from the very first distinguishes the most incompetent architect from the best of bees is that the architect has built a cell in his head before he constructs it in wax, and the labor process ends in the creation of something which, when the process began, already existed in the worker's imagination, already existed in an ideal form. What happens is not merely the worker brings about a change of form in natural objects. At the same time, when the nature exists apart from himself, he realizes his own purpose, the purpose which gives the laws to his activities, the purpose to which he has to subordinate his own will. This spiritual quality also gives man his superiority in the whole of nature. of which he is thus the summit and the center. The spirit which materialism denies, and spirit with a capital letter, absolute, independent, substantial spirit, considered as the reality par excellence, nay, the sole reality, the reality of which nature is but an exteriorization and degradation, a projection. But the spirit of nature, an expansion of nature, nature simply overflowing in itself in a way and asserting itself in its highest expressions, that spirit being a superior product of matter, a superior expansion of matter as it manifests itself in man. Communist materialism does not in the least profess to deny, suppress, annihilate. It was in this sense that Feuerbach had already established this materialism. I just realized that I read this on the last episode. So, unfortunately, I just read a little too much. So of what I've already read. So I'm going to continue to the next part, I guess. Yeah. Appreciate you guys for showing up. Um, I read it last time, so I guess I forgot that I did that. I could finish it. I don't know if I read it. Let's see. I think I did. Did I? Did I not? I don't know. You know what? I'm just going to continue reading from where I was, and if I already read it, so be it. It is what it is. All right. Okay. We're at Feuerbach. Had already established his materialism as an affirmation of man upon the summit of reality, making him thus, as it were, the central object of philosophy, action, conscious class action. The revolutionary energy of the proletariat would clearly be meaningless, just as meaningless for that matter, inversely, as bourgeoisie class consciousness, and the energy of resistance shown by the established bourgeoisie order and opposing the assertion to the power of the proletariat. This purely determinist interpretation of materialism gave rise to reformist tendencies. Reform is conceiving that it was sufficient to wait for the mere play of economic laws to affect the socialist transformation of society. I don't think I read this. Uh, Orthodox communism, however, has never ceased to oppose them. It is nonetheless true that we are faced with a very genuine materialism, on the more dangerous for being the less susceptible of summary statement to the question which reality, spirit, or nature is primordial. The answer is still nature. That is to say, matter. Matter remains the core, the substance, and the spirit is only matter in some way or other surpassing itself to the point of becoming strong itself. The three postulates of communist materialism: 1. There is no spirit without matter. 2. There is no substantial spirit. 3. The spirit while emerging therefore from. So basically, they see the spirit as just like a concept. It's like you could say, well, that man has spirit, but they don't necessarily believe in a real spirit in a man, you know. So it's just an ideal, you know. These guys don't believe in anything but themselves, really. It's just this really prideful thought that says, well, God doesn't exist, and this is a bumpkin ideology, and when men were stupid and just developing, we're far superior to that. We've surpassed the gods. We are our own gods. And it's always this, the death of God will bring about the superiority of man. And it's the classic going back to the garden. What Lucifer promised man in the garden is like, if you eat of the fruit, you'll become like gods. without God. That's always been the great temptation, So it says here, it says, all Christianity revolts from this out and out idealism precisely because it is Christianity. That is to say, a religion with an acute sense of carnal reality, the sense of the incarnation, which is beyond them. God's incarnation into the body. If you even bring up the Logos, see, they'll say, well, Christians basically stole from philosophy, and that's how, it's all Platonic. It developed out of Platonism. Well, that's not true. You read the early writers like John, St. John, who wrote 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, Revelations. So he talks about the Logos. Now, Heraclitus talked about the Logos. And then you got Lao Tzu, who talked about the Tao, which the Tao is, the ordering principle before time, symmetry, proportion, the adaptation of one thing to another. But, they didn't really fully understand God in a real sense. They had an impersonal God, you know. They understood that there was a pattern that organized reality, that there was a way that things went, There's a flow to things. The river moves a certain way, the seasons change a certain way. They seen that the sun came up and the night came, 12 hours type thing. They seen some symmetry in reality, and they called this the Logos. Well, John says, in the beginning was the Word, right? In the beginning was the Logos. So we're finally getting to know who the Logos is. Logos is Christ. He is the way, the truth, and the life. The incarnation is finally the point where philosophy is no longer just an idea, it's a reality. Who is this ordering principle before time? It is God. And it's God in the flesh, the God man, Christ. So it's no longer Platonic, They're that's why the early Christian philosophers looked at the philosophers as they seen Christianity as a superior philosophy because it's the fulfillment of all these philosophies. Um, Anyways, it goes on. It says it would not uh, it would not do to infer that Christian thought sides with the idealism to which Marxist materialism is opposed. Christian thought undoubtedly returns to the same answer as idealism to the question, which is the primordial element, spirit or matter? When it says spirit, but Christianity and idealism are nevertheless in many aspects radically incompatible, without a doubt, because we're no longer just stuck in the realm of ideas. We're talking about realities now. The Logos is no more just a concept for philosophers to debate about. You know, this is a reality that was born of a virgin and walked among us and was crucified and resurrected. So we're not idealists. We're realists, really. But it's a reality too unbelievable for so many to comprehend. That they have to cope in some way with it. Because if God isn't impersonal and He's a personal God, then there's expectations that come with it, and people don't want to be responsible. And it's funny, they say, well, Christians want just a light cloud to lay on. They're scared of death or something. Well, if that were true, then why did all the apostles run to their deaths to proclaim the truth of Christ? It's like, how do 12 illiterate fishermen take the whole world in their nets? How does that happen? That's a phenomenon. Anyways, um, idealists indeed look upon the idea as the only reality in matter, but as an exteriorization of it, a degradation to a more different and in kind form of spirit, the spirit that differs in kind from matter in Marxism. All Christianity revolts from this out and out idealism precisely because it is Christianity, that is to say, a religion with an acute sense of carnal reality, the sense of the incarnation, and everybody is aware of the insistence which all Christian philosophy lays upon considering the body of man as an integrating part of his substance. Christianity is spiritualist, not idealist. It is not the same thing. Hegel's idealism was anti-Christian before the materialism of Feuerbach or Marx. The materialist reaction of those philosophers has at bottom something which may even be described as gratifying. It is a reaction of good sense, sound health, nature, which Marx found repugnant in idealism. It is no less repugnant to us, and we are concerned as he for reality. But his reaction went too far and went to the opposite extreme, and while retaining the same confusion of principle, fell into an error still more serious than the idealist error. May it not be said that it was because of idealism. I see. Idealism absorbed matter into mind. Materialism absorbs mind into matter. Christian thought, on the other hand, perceives mind and matter alike by grading them, by maintaining each in its proper relation to the other, but this can only be done by subordinating matter to mind, for the mind must incontestably come first, thought and reality. The second aspect of the fundamental philosophical problem to which Marxism professes to offer solution is stated by Engels as follows, quote, "The question of the relation of thinking being has yet another side. And on what relation do our thoughts about the world surrounding us stand to the world itself? Is our thinking capable of the cognition of the real world? Are we able to, in our ideas and notions of the real world, to produce a correct reflection of reality? This is indeed the classic and fundamental problem of knowledge." As to this, communist materialism adapts a definitively objective attitude, and its reply is definitively affirmative. Our ideas, representations of the world, do effectively correspond with reality. Communism, in this respect, is logical with its materialism. The reason it gives for its realism is in effect the quote, "The ideal is nothing else than the material world reflected by the human mind and transferred into forms of thought." The primacy of matter in relation to mind once admitted, it is impossible for mind to be the cause of itself and to find within itself the explanation of its activities. It exists merely as an expansion of matter and acts likewise only when moved and determined by an object, which is material and consequently real. Communist materialism also condemns as the worst aberration agnosticism of every shape and kind, and the whole series of philosophers, quote, "who question the possibility of any cognition, or at least of an exhaustive cognition of the world," chief of whom among modern philosophers Engels cites Hume and Kant. The justice, for the most part, of the communist criticism of the idealism must here be acknowledged. A Christian philosopher finds no difficulty in admitting the thesis that it is not consciousness which determines being, but being which determines consciousness. Idealist philosophy, lightly, almost inevitably tending to lapse into subjectivism, has for this reason always been regarded with suspicion, and even in many cases condemned by the Church. It is a philosophy of the sort which is at the root of modernism. Here again, communist philosophy appears as a healthy reaction against undeniable aberrations, but here again also has unfortunately overstepped the mark. The reality which communism allows our minds to know can be no other than the only reality which it admits, the reality of material facts, and that being so, our ideas, so far as they express anything other than that reality, anything transcending that reality, anything intelligible, different in any kind from matter, particularly if it be conceived as subsisting independently of matter and otherwise that than matter. Such spiritual knowledge for Marxism is only and cannot be other than illusory, a dream, a myth. It must also be acknowledged that it is just as much on account of its claim to attain the spiritual, if not more than on account of its subjectivism. that Marxism combats idealism. Marxism does not combat idealism so much as idealism, but idealism as spiritualism. Marx decidedly rejected not only idealism, Lenin declares, quote, always connected in one way or another with religion, but also the views of humankind that are especially widespread in our day. Okay, so taking exceptions a priori to every non material object of knowledge, Marxism admits no other criterion of truth than experience and production. Action, referred to in the beginning as the criterion of truth, is and can only be that sort of material action. It is undeniable that on this point also Christian and Marxist thought are radically incompatible. Marxist thought is also realist, but realist in a very different way. I mean, Christian thought is also realist, but realist in a very different way from Marxist. Realism, sure, in its realism of attaining into every reality, how poor soever, some other than the pure sensible materiality, something specifically intelligible not to be in any way accounted for by experience or production alone. Much more, the realism of Christian philosophy is sure of obtaining beyond the sensible world, a world or realities far more real than all the realities of the visible world, a world of realities inaccessible to experience and incapable of being produced industriously, but susceptible of being known by our minds with a certitude no less rigorous than our positively scientific certitude. Dialectic materialism. Dialectical materialism. How's everybody doing? I'm gonna check on this chat real quick. See what's up. Appreciate it. Yeah. Indeed. Well, I had started it earlier, and I had to go do something, so I kind of restarted, really, so you didn't miss much. So here we go. Dialectical materialism. Let me get something here. Okay. So it says something more yet remains to be said of the specifically philosophical materialism of Marxism. One essential feature of it, not yet mentioned, must now at all costs be brought out. If we are not seriously to go astray in the matter, and what we shall have to say will also throw a flood of light on much of the preceding discussion. Marxist materialism is to be specifically distinguished from all former kinds of materialism by the fact that it professes to be a dialectical materialism. It is of the first importance to grasp this, for all Marxist sociology, and more particularly its essential revolutionary character, depends upon it. Just as Marxism was philosophically materialist before becoming so socially, it is philosophically revolutionary because before becoming so socially in its revolutionary nature is expressed philosophically in dialectic. Marx inherited this sense of dialectic from Hegel, whereas others, the conservatives, stressed the idealist content of Hegel's philosophy. The quote Hegelian left, to which Marx belonged, were more attracted by his dialectical method. And when Marx, on becoming a materialist, rejected all idealism, he was careful, unlike Feuerbach and the rest, to retain the dialectical method for application to his materialism. The nature of Hegelian dialectic, however, was, as we shall see, completely transformed. Dialectic in Hegel's philosophy is a particular method of thought, a system of logic based upon contradiction, as opposed to the logical uh, logic generally accepted, which was based upon identity. The logic of identity starts from the principle that contradiction is a repugnant to thought as it is to being. Being is what it is. It cannot at the same time be and not be. It is itself identical and repugnant to non being, its opposite. That being so, nothing is affirmed, acknowledged for true by thought unless it is based upon some identity or other. So it's funny he's talking about being and non being here. Because I said Taoist, we talk about that in Taoism in a little bit, or well, Lao Tzu's teaching, because modern Taoism is a little different. But being and non being, because in the Tao, it's like if you looked at a window, what is the usefulness of the window? It's the space, you know, where you put the glass. It's like that would be the non-being of the window or something. But the usefulness is in that non-being, or like an axis on a wheel or something. 30 spokes joined to a single hub. Its usefulness is in the center. Um, but here he's saying that logic of identity starts from the principle of the contradiction and repugnant to thought as it is to being. Being is what it is. It cannot at the same time be and not be. It is self-identical and repugnant to non-being. So they're missing, I think, a concept here, even in this. It's opposite. That being so, nothing is affirmed and acknowledged for true by thought unless it is based upon some identity or other. So things have to have an identity. So I think that the fact that they can't identify something with their minds is what deters them from the reality of God. It's like if you can't yourself touch, feel, and see it, but why, they're not taking the steps to go about it. If you're not taking those steps, it's like it's some cognitive thing where you're avoiding lifting up that stone or something. Hegel's logic proceeds in an absolutely opposite way. He concedes the contradiction, so far from being repugnant to thought, is essentially to it. The mind cannot take a step without contradiction. Thought can conceive nothing, affirm nothing, without there being a contradiction inherent in its very affirmation. The idea of being, for example, is possible only if it contains intrinsically its opposite, the idea of non-being. Okay, so maybe he does get a little bit. Take away the idea of non-being from the idea of being, and the idea of being collapses. See, I agree with that. The opposition of this contradiction is thus the very principle of thought. Now, contradiction plays such a part not only in the origin and structure of the most elementary affirmations of the idea, but also in its development and progress for movement becoming. Is but a specific result of such opposition. The essence of thought is just that very becoming. That being so, whereas the logic of identity is a static logic, culminating, stable, absolute, definitive, invariably certainties, dialectical logic is propounded by Hegel as essentially dynamic logic, admitting movement, change, and relative as the elder centuries. Quote, here lay the true significance and the revolutionary character of the Hegelian philosophy. According to Engels, quote, that it once and for all dealt the death blow to the finality of all products of human thought and action. Truth, the cognition of what is the business of philosophy, came in the hand of Hegel no longer an aggregate of the finished dogmatic statements which one discovered had merely to be learned by heart. Truth lay now in the process of cognition itself, and the long historical development of science, which mounts from the lower to ever higher levels of knowledge without ever reaching by discovering so-called absolute truth, a point which it can proceed no further, and where it would have nothing more to do than fold its hands and admire the absolute truth to which it had attained, and which holds good for the realm of philosophic knowledge, holds good also for every other kind of knowledge, and also for practical affairs. Such, broadly speaking, is the dialectic of Hegel. at all events, as Marx and Engels conceived it, for Hegel is expressing primarily the law of thought, of the idea. It is a system of logic only by reaction, and consequently does it become the law of things. Quote, according to Hegel, Engel writes, quote, dialectics is the self-development of the concept. The absolute concept does not only exist where unknown from eternity, it is also the actual living soul of the whole existing world. The dialectical development apparent in nature and history is only a miserable copy of the self-move of the concept of going from eternity. No one knows where, but at all events, independently of any thinking human brain. Karl Marx, herein lies his originality, transplanted the dialectical process, so to speak, from thought into reality, but in so doing turned it upside down. Quote, thereby the dialectic of the concept itself became merely the conscious reflex of the dialectical motion of the real world, and the dialectic of Hegel was placed upon his head, or further, turned off its head, in which it was standing before, and placed upon its feet again. My own dialectical method, says Marx, quote, is not only fundamentally different from the Hegelian dialectical method, but it is the direct opposite. For Hegel, the thought process, which he actually transformed into an independent subject, giving to the name of, quote, idea, is the demiurge creator of the real. And for him, the real is only the outward manifestation of the idea. Huh. In my view, on the other hand, the idea is nothing other than the material when it has been transposed and translated into the human head. The vast consequences of this application of dialectic to materialism must be thoroughly grasped. Nothing exists but what is intrinsically contradictory. Contradiction Contradiction is at the very heart of reality, and the essence of it is reality itself, which only by a contradiction can assert itself. But at the same time, and to the same extent, reality exists only dynamically and in motion. It is intimately and essentially movement, becoming nothing but that it is a perpetual self evolution, a constant changing of self. Change is the law of its being, its very nature. It is autodynamic. Change and movement do not come to it from without. They are inherent in it. They are itself. In other words, reality finds within itself its own casualty. It is also easy to see that such change, the product of clashes, oppositions, contradictions, self destructions, does not proceed linearly in a straight line, but in a zigzag spiral direction, and also by clashes, jerks, fits, starts, violent shocks, catastrophes, in a word, revolutions. Reality, therefore, becomes essentially revolutionary. Revolution become the organic law of the world and life. The the conservatism of such a conception is relative. Its revolutionary character absolute, the only absolute which allows to prevail. Engels describes it characteristically. Characteristics again as follows. Quote, it does not move in the eternal oneness of a perpetual recurring cycle, but goes through a real historic evolution. Elsewhere, he distinguishes a dialectical movement from one of the simple continuations in a direction, cycle, or otherwise, by the following characteristics. It is a process which is a antagonistic in nature. B involves a contradiction from which arises a whole series of contradictions. C is overall, as well as in its details, a transformation of an extreme into an opposite. And D, and therefore has the kernel of its process, the negation of the negation, from which the whole movement arose. The profound difference between this dialectical materialism and earlier forms of materialism is now easy to perceive. They were all inspired by a logic of identity. matter being incapable of being conceived by them otherwise than in a rigid, static, inerrant state, could only be moved mechanically from without. Determinism was the consequence. Gradient movement in such matter could receive only from without also. Everyone is determinations. It was rigid. In some, it was rigid in summary determinism against which Leninist Marxism never ceased to protect. Communist materialism is far more rich, far more complex, far more plausible, and is easy to understand why it should describe the other as vulgar materialism. But the immense difference between the materialist dialectic and the idealist dialectic is no less easy to perceive. And one concrete point where it is most apparent may be noted. Whereas dialectical materialism was content to transfer revolution as an endemic condition to the sphere of ideas, reckoning upon ideas alone to transform the world, and this was in the very logic of idealism. Materialist dialectic insists primarily upon a real revolution, because it regards ideas as nothing but the reflection of the real word projected in the brain. The question then arises, does this dialectical character of Marxist materialism still further increase the opposition noticed a little while back between communist and Christian thought? The answer is that there would appear to be no doubt about it. Nothing, however, is less certain than that Christian thought agrees with the static logic of identity of it as Hegel and Marx conceived it for the purpose of criticizing it. Christian thought is far from denying the part played by the contradiction both in the activity of thought and in the development of the world, but that does not mean to say that it can admit contradiction, and so becoming, and consequently the relative, to be the very stuff of reality and the fundamental law of thought. Christianity finds Hegelianism no less distasteful in this respect than Marxism, and that question has long been since thrashed out. So, you know, we're going to continue with the psychology of the contemporary enthusiasm on communist sympathies in the West, or I might start with, what I'm thinking. Actually, I might start with communism and ecumenism, which is another article I found from the Orthodox Word. So I'm gonna go there, and but before I do that, I'm gonna take a break, for a moment, and you're welcome to check it out if you guys feel like it. So I'm gonna hit the music box for a moment. Um, Give everybody a break to take in that thing, and maybe more viewers come check it out. It is what it is. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to return with this article on communism and ecumenism. That's what I'm going to do. Okay. Okay, it says ecumenism and communism, and Orthodox Christians living behind the Iron Curtain. The beginning of the new and redoubled persecution of Christianity within the Soviet Union in this decade coincides with the entrance of the Moscow Patriarchate into the World Council of Churches in 1961. To the Soviet government, those are but two aspects of its relentless campaign against religion: to destroy it at home, to infiltrate abroad. But what prompts official ecumenism to accept such a program was scarcely a ripple of protest. This article, written by a member of that martyric race of Orthodox Christians living behind the Iron Curtain, uh, penetrates to the heart of this question and finds ecumenism and communism, despite their outward contradictions, to be brothers and allies in their battle against the Church of Christ. The article was given to the Monsieur Elise Ruart, a French Orthodox partisan, with the request that it is published in the West. The author, for understandable reasons, wishes to remain unknown. Okay, it says, we are not going to discuss atheistic communism here. It is so primitive and barbaric that it is not even worthwhile for one to refute it, like a wild animal. It knows nothing except to overturn and to destroy, without ever attracting. Meanwhile, next to communism, there is ecumenism, which seeks to ensnare souls by preaching the unity of Christians, lying in wait like a siren for its victims. However, it is exactly in the countries of militant atheism that, quote, faith in ecumenism is becoming more apparent. This is something that should make us doubt its Christian character. In reality, there are two brothers. Um, with all their apparent contradictions, are nothing else deep down but children of the same, quote, father of lies, creations of worldwide Freemasonry. The subject concerns two brothers. Similar sound of those names symbolizes their common descent. In fact, what is not in Geneva, under Masonic neutrality, which is so characteristic of Switzerland, that Lenin, with the support of the lodges, formed the great conspiracy which prepared for the revolution of 1917 against Orthodox Russia, with militant atheism being the first point of its program. Um, It says down here, this is a little note on the bottom. It says, the kinship of such neutrality with communism was further demonstrated in November of 1967 by official ceremonies in Geneva by uh, cantonal, cantonal and municipal authorities to mark the 50th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. A memorial plaque was placed on the house where Lenin lived, and Lenin's stay of several years in Geneva, together with his revolutionary activities there, were commemorated in a booklet issued, quote, Lenin in Geneva. See Orthodox Russia, 1967, number 22. Okay, so it goes on. It says, Geneva also, that was formed in 1927. Only 10 years later, the, quote, World Council of Churches, which is nothing else but a lower, quote, profane branch of Freemasonry, such as the Rotary and the Scouting. Uh, the members of the latter organization are not necessarily initiated, or for this reason, at first glance, their relationship with the lodge are not apparent. But in their aim, they follow the lodge's directives accordingly to the letter. Just as everywhere else, here also Masonry strives to bring about a confusion of ideas, which will help it to assimilate the great masses by applying a principle which is exactly opposite to, quote, divide and conquer. That is, quote, combine and govern. and in this way paralyzing all spiritual powers through adulteration and imitation. Thus, ecumenism strives to replace the true concept of the Church, one holy, Catholic, and apostolic, by means of subversive ideas of a pan-heretical union. In fact, ecumenism shows no interest in distinguishing between truth and heresy. On the contrary, it invites all the confessions to combine in a synthesis where the word, quote, heresy is absent. From practical reasons, it does not exist even as a possibility. Within ecumenism, the Church ceases to be a unique, living entity and becomes a general idea, including in an equalizing manner the various types of, quote, Christian churches. Thus, the Church of Christ loses her concrete meaning, her very essence, and is brought down to the level of a general abstraction. This precisely appears behind the ambiguous assertions of the former General Secretary of the World Council of Churches, Vassar Hoof. Ecumenism is entitled a, quote, federation of churches. It itself is not a church, but the will of God. As I see it, may become one day the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Huh. Wow. Okay, so that was from some document the guy wrote. It says, well, we must also mention the assertion that escaped the mouth of Anderson while speaking to an Orthodox proto-presbyter during one of the meetings in Athens in 1938. Quote, we will not be pedantic any longer, he said. Quote, the next step in ecumenical activity would be the union of Christians with the faithful of other religions on the basis of the principle of monotheism. So they don't want to just stop at joining all the confessions of faith under one banner. They want all faiths under one banner. And uh, in the early 70s, Satanism even had a seat at the World Council of Churches. Not a lot of people know that, but there were Satanists there. So it goes on. It says the ever memorable Metropolitan of Samos, Arianios, had very correctly observed the total absence of a Trinitarian concept. Okay, I'm going to read this footnote. It says, Orthodox ecumenists, 30 years later, have not declared themselves ready for this step. The official have now declared themselves ready for this step. The official statement of the 19th Clergy Lady Congress of the Greek Archdiocese of the North and South America meeting in Athens in July 1968 included the following assertion. Quote, we believe that the ecumenical movement, even though it is of Christian origin, must become a movement of all religions reaching towards each other. Yeah, but they're not heretics, All right. Crazy. All right, so we're going on. It says the dogmatic basis preached by ecumenism is constantly a stress that God is one, without mention of the Holy Trinity. Thus, when even after the observations of Arianios, there was added at the end, so that it could easily be removed of the ecumenical creed, the phrase, quote, of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The whole construction gave the impression of the monistic concept held by the ancient heretical Montanists, who saw in the three persons of the Holy Trinity nothing but three manners and manifestations of of a single God. Oh wow, Montanist, I guess. Yeah. Furthermore, if there were in ecumenism a true triadology, this triadology should have been the basis of Christology, since Christ is the hypostatic incarnation of the second person, the Holy Trinity. However, ecumenism systematically avoids professing Christ as the incarnate God. Once, when this concrete formulation was proposed, it was not adopted at all. So, something which is very characteristic of the secret anti-Christian views of the World Council. Furthermore, the Christology which ecumenism puts forth in its profession of faith in, quote, Christ, God and Savior, does not offer any guarantee of orthodoxy, because under this exceedingly broad label, all the heresies of Christianity can fit. Furthermore, will not the Antichrist himself come with the assertion that he is God? That's 2 Thessalonians 2 and 4. But let us return to the secret relations of ecumenism with its brother, communism. which alone can explain the the intensification of the position of ecumenism in the countries behind the Iron Curtain. And at first, we must stress the exceedingly important point that the entrance of the Russian Church into the World Council of Churches in 1961 coincided with the intensification of the persecutions on the part of the atheists. One would expect that this uh, approachment with the World Council of Churches would have at least brought about an abatement a persecution against the Russian Church, and it was without a doubt for her the only valid justification for such an adventure undertaking. In spite of this, no such thing took place. On the contrary, the atheistic frenzy which was ravaging the church had doubled its wrath since then. In the face of this event, how can anyone explain the absolute silence of the World Council, which, in spite of the fact that it preaches itself to be the champion of faith and order on a worldwide scale, nevertheless tolerates without any protest a militant atheism which acts publicly, a disorder so flagrant, a violation so manifest of the most elementary constitutional rights? The justification which Nikita Struve gives of such a defeatist position seems to us strangely naive. Quote, if Geneva keeps silent, he writes, quote, it is because an official protest would immediately bring a sharp conflict with the representation of the churches which are behind the Iron Curtain and which recently have accepted into the ecumenical movement. Nikita Struve, Los Christians on URSS, Paris, 1963, page 282. But if the World Council of Churches was sincerely resolved to defend the Christian faith, and in this specific case, orthodoxy, why indeed should it fear to cause a conflict? An artificial one, furthermore. In this matter, with its representatives of the churches beyond the Iron Curtain, something which have been the only means of putting things in order. Furthermore, some 2 years ago, did not the exarch of the Russian Patriarchate in the Western Europe, remaining always faithful to his canonical obedience, protest emphatically in the name of his obedience against the atheistic persecutions, with the danger of bringing about unavoidable conflicts? If therefore the World Council of Churches melts away in the face of militant atheism, it is because, by reason of its Masonic allegiance, it feels inwardly much more in common with the agents of the worldwide communism than with the representatives of the Orthodox Church. These latter are nothing but pawns, directed willy-nilly in a game of mutual compromises by which political elements will be benefited, elements which, under the pretense that they look with favor upon the church, finally paralyze her. Thus, once more, and confirm that compromises in religion never lead to victory. Here we should mention as historical example as Gaston Boisier has very well demonstrated the immense inim- inimical, I don't know, maybe this inimical attitude of the Roman rulers toward the first Christians was caused primarily by the intransigence of the latter and by their categorical refusal to allow Christ to be included in that broad pantheon in which Rome had gathered all the gods of idolatry. Quote, it was this stubborn insistence of theirs on separating themselves thus from the rest of the world in order to keep their faith pure from every alien admixture which alone can explain the violence of persecutions, the victims of which were the Christians for 3 centuries. Gaston Bossior, La Religion Remains d'Auguste something, Paris, 1884, pages 402 through 3. The ancient church preferred, therefore, to endure the harshest persecutions, over which uh, uh, she triumphed furthermore, rather than to participate in an idolatrous syncretism, which uh, would have assailed its very Christian essence. Unfortunately, in our days, the example of the ancient church has not been followed. The ecumenism of Geneva is a tributary of a religious syncretism with a Masonic basis. for which the present is called Christian, quote, Christian, by way of window dressing, by using the strong arm which its partners, communism, has lent it, has managed to attract practically the whole of the Orthodox Church into its nets, at least in the person of its official representatives, who, of course, in this case, are far from expressing the voice of the Orthodox people. And this was Britain, late '60s, early '70s. Would assume maybe before that. And at one time, we could probably say it's like, you know, um, Roper wasn't necessarily willing to come out and be like everybody's graceless in the official jurisdictions, because we have to take into account that this was just at the period where this was starting. You know what I mean? It hadn't fully developed into what we see today. And the faithful were still Orthodox for the most part. It's their leaders that weren't. But in the case of today, sure, there might be some that don't know that, their leaders, their hierarchies in heresy. And maybe God will be more merciful towards them for not knowing. But there are those that know, right? And not only do they know, they'll write, disseminating defenses of the position of their hierarchy. And that makes you wonder, as like, has the cancer spread to the laity now? It's no longer just, the hierarchs, it's the priest and the laity. It's like everybody now is on board with it one way or another. Even if they don't outwardly admit it, they still go along with it. They don't break communion with the heretics. They don't supposedly they fight from within, but anybody who really has anything to say about it, um, is kind of just like complaining within. Um, and I mean, and at this point, as far as the anathema ecumenism it goes, it for those who knowingly disseminate for heretical ecumenism, and that's what you see amongst the faithful of their churches. So I mean, it's kind of unexcusable at this point. The way I see it is the ecumenical cancer has spread, um, and there's no excuse. At one time, maybe there was, and that's why they like to go back to the '70s and be like, "Well, see, like they didn't say we were outright heretics," and it's like, yeah, but what about all the other things that have happened since the '70s? We're in 2025 now, and this is we've got Bartholomew talking about going into communion with the Pope of Rome now. And there's been numerous ecumenical gatherings and meetings, and everybody, even the people online now, the majority are pushing the same things that people like Bartholomew say. So it's kind of strange. Anyways, and it says the false position in which the Orthodox find themselves within this Masonic pantheon, that is the World Council of Geneva, wherein Orthodoxy uh, sees that she is assigned an ecumenically acceptable role as the extreme right of the spectrum of the Protestant, quote, confessions, has already begun to prevail in the awareness of everyone. It is truly tragic that the theologians and, quote, representatives of Orthodoxy, with very few exceptions, so easily accepted this position, and thus, without understanding it, found themselves on the same level as the offshoots of the competing Western heresies. The blame must be put on those Orthodox who have accepted the principle of all the, quote, confessions and applying it to the Orthodox Church, once more betraying their mission, their very essence, which is something totally different from all these heretical systems, which is the Church herself in all her fullness and unity. The, quote, separate Orthodox statements, which have been added to virtually all the decisions of the Great Ecumenical Conference, show clearly in her fertility the feeling of Orthodox representatives have had that they are found in an erroneous position, a feeling that explains the continuous anguish of the Orthodox in the ecumenical movement. Furthermore, so that we may speak specifically of the Great Church of Russia, which is entering into even more trials, there certainly could be no thought of her entering into the World Council of Churches without the consent, or rather the pressure of the Soviet state. Yet one can be sure that this would have not brought the Church to such a compromise if some genuine advantage would not result. This is precisely what Nikita Struve has emphasized. Quote, by looking with favor upon the external relations of the Russian Church, the Soviet government managed to neutralize the various Western protests which could have lifted their voice for the Christians of Russia. Oh, wow. The forced entrance of the Russian Church into the World Council is nothing else, therefore, but another form, much more dangerous because it is cunning, of persecution against the Orthodox Church. Thus, Masonry and Communism, notwithstanding all their external disputes, put forth their hands in order to destroy, each for its own side, the Church of Christ, just as in the past the Pharisees and the Sadducees fought together against Christ himself. Thus, significant is the fact that in 1962, only a few months after the entrance of the Russian Church into the World Council, the Archbishop of the Anglican Church, which officially visited Moscow during the greatest intensity of the persecutions, found nothing better to do than to joke with Mikoyan, and this ecumenical communist flirtation did not begin just lately. 20 years ago, the dean of the Cathedral Church of Canterbury, Hewitt, uh, Hewlett Johnson, published a laudatory trilogy concerning, quote, socialism, the, quote, power and the success of the Soviets. In conclusion, he drew a parallel between Lenin and Christ, since, as it seems, both had the well-being of the mankind as their ideal. He ends by proclaiming the Soviet Union to be, quote, an ally with everything that is best, which exists in religions of the world. He's talking about, Lenin here, and comparing him with Christ. This is the Anglican, uh, this guy from the Cathedral Church of Canterbury. Thus, the Orthodox Church behind the Iron Curtain is found subjected by two allied yokes: the yoke of ecumenism, which comes to double the yoke of communism. This Masonic atheistic alliance gives birth to disheartening aberrations which make every Orthodox heart bleed. For instance, an address given at the ordination of an Orthodox, a convert from Roman Catholicism in Paris, in a heterodox church building, had to be mutilated in the very essence and pruned of every criticism of heterodoxy in order to be published in Moscow. Compare the two periodicals. It gives two periodicals here in French. And it mentions the Journal of the Moscow Patriarchate in 1962, number 2, page 29. This Orthodox Church desires to celebrate a local anniversary, but is not forbidden to invite other sister Orthodox churches, whereas it is obliged to celebrate in the presence of representatives of the World Council. The Orthodox Russian clergy, which is forbidden to preach, is obliged to give its place to foreign ecumenists who preach freely in Orthodox temples, to the great scandal of the Orthodox people. See the Journal of the Moscow Patriarchate, 1964, number 5, page 39, 6 through 39. The professor ecumenists of the West travel freely in these lands in order to give lectures in the theological academies and there to expound ecumenical subjects. Ecumenism, a Masonic invention, seeks to reduce all religions to an equal level, to knead them to the same kneading bowl in order solely to prepare the paste of religious indifference, a foreshadow symptom of the Antichrist. The so called, quote, Christian ecumenism of Geneva is in reality a disguise for a clearly anti Christian ideology which comprises with militant atheism. This precisely explains the ecumenist reign of terror which rules mainly behind the Iron Curtain, as well as also at the silence of the World Council in the face of militant atheism, so that all skepticism in this matter may be done away. Let us ask ourselves, what other power besides that of communism, allies with ecumenism, could oblige the Metropolitan of Leningrad, Nicodim, during the recent assembly of the World Peace Conference in Paraguay, to take part in an ecumenical, quote, worship service? together with Protestant pastors, and in particular published a photograph of this service on expensive paper in an 8th volume of the Journal of the Moscow Patriarchate, to greater scandal of the Orthodox people. In violation of the 10th and 45th Apostolic Canons, which forbid Orthodox under penalty of excommunication from any joint prayer, how much more so joint worship with heretics. Formerly, there was no question of more than ecumenistic common prayer at which the Orthodox were simply present. Lately, there has been devised the term, quote, ecumenic worship, in which Orthodox clergymen must take part. The next step would undoubtedly be Eucharistic concelebration, which will also mark the final fall of the allegedly, quote, Orthodox representatives. Orthodox Christians. In our days, which are devoured by ecumenist madness, we comprise the remnant that is according to the election of the grace, this remnant in Israel that has not been the need of Baal. Romans 11:4-5. This privilege imposes the imperative duty on us to struggle to preserve orthodoxy from ecumenist defilement, which it sells it. To us, it is to turn to the gaze of the Orthodox living behind the Iron Curtain, who were reduced to lamentable defeatism as a result of the pressure exercised upon them by atheistic communism and strengthened by its counterpart, Masonic ecumenism, which perpetuates an ecclesiastical heresy of the most dangerous type. We, by the very fact of our faith in orthodoxy, are called by divine providence to preach the true orthodox ecumenism, which raises the standard of truth above all else, which without any distinction of discrimination of race or nation or language receives and embraces all men of good will who are honorably and fervently seek original Christianity, which is truly ecumenical, which is nothing else but the pure Orthodox faith handed down as an inheritance by our Lord Jesus Christ to his apostles, and which is proclaimed by the Holy Orthodox Church, which even the gates of hell has yet to have been able, nor shall ever be able, to cast down. Okay, so that's it for the night. I did an hour. I didn't get to the main thing I was going to do, but what can I do? I appreciate everybody that stopped by. Um, thank you, Denise, as always. You're cool for that. What's up, Sunrise? Later, man. And I'm on Unseen Warfare, and I'll come back soon. Appreciate everybody. Later.